So this is a story of thanksgiving. Thanksgiving that rises in response to the border-crossing, boundary-breaking love of Christ. It's a little story that's situated in the larger story of the border-breaking, boundary-crossing love of Christ. Luke tells us that Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem, which is never just a geographic reference, always a theological reference as well, always a spiritual reference as well, because Luke wants us to know and never forget where Jesus is taking us and that something significant is going to happen when we get there. He's on his way to Jerusalem, traveling along the border between Samaria and Galilee. And as he was going into a village, Luke tells us, he's approached by 10 people with leprosy who stand at a distance. Now, when was the last time you heard a story from the Bible about people with leprosy that you were able to resonate with this much? They stood at a distance. They stood at a distance not because they were in awe, but because it was the law. Because Numbers and Leviticus said that if you had leprosy, this noticeable skin disease that they felt like was connected not only to your physical health, but to your spiritual health, then you needed to live outside of the camp. You needed to live outside of the community. You needed to stay at a distance. And if anyone were to approach you or you were to approach them and they didn't have leprosy, then you needed to yell out, "Unclean, unclean, unclean," so that they would know that you were unclean and that you might render them unclean. So you can imagine these people lived in a state of isolation, loneliness, and shame. And it's from that place that they approached Jesus on this day. These people had lived in the abnormal for so long, I imagine, that the abnormal had started to feel like normal. Sound familiar? They'd lived in the abnormal so long that the abnormalcy of having leprosy and all that came with it had started to feel like their normal. And yet, they also lived with some semblance of hope that something or someone might change their situation one day. And they might once again be able to live with some semblance of normalcy. And they'd heard about this man who was coming through their town named Jesus, who'd healed the lame and made the blind to see. And they wondered if they approached him at a distance, not because they were in awe, but because of the law, but they were in awe. And they cried out to him and asked him to help if he might actually see them and help them. Many people, when they'd come by, even as they yelled unclean, would pretend like they weren't there. Walk on by them like we walk by panhandlers on the plaza, pretending not to see. But Luke says on this day, as they stood at a distance and cried out to Christ, that he didn't walk on by, that he saw them, one of them, at least one of them being a Samaritan. Remember, this is about the border-crossing and boundary-breaking love of Christ. And when he saw the need, he decided to meet the need, not touching them, but telling them to turn around and go ahead and go to the priest for their clean bill of health. And as they went, they were healed. As they went on their way, they were made clean. And Luke tells us that 9 kept going and 1 came back. Now, why did they keep going? Maybe they attributed their new health to something other than Jesus that happened along the way. Maybe they just thought Jesus told them to go and so they should go and not come back and thank him for what he'd done. Maybe they thought, well, they'd gotten what they needed and that was what they needed, and so they were going to go ahead and go on their way. He doesn't tell us why the 9 didn't come back, though Jesus certainly wonders why the 9 didn't come back. But what he does tell us is that in response to the border crossing and boundary breaking love of Christ, this one Samaritan man returned, threw himself down at Jesus' feet, and erupted in a moment of thanksgiving. Was no one else found to return, Jesus said? Just this foreigner? No? Rise up then and go, for your faith has made you well. Rise up then and go, for your faith has made you well. The word rise up there in chapter 17 of Luke's Gospel is the same word that is sometimes translated resurrection. Or, as we heard earlier in the baptism today, raised to walk in newness of life. The 9 were healed, just like the 10th. But something happened in the 10th's response of thanksgiving and praise to God that brought about an extra measure of resurrection life into his life, so that he was able to rise and walk in newness of life in a way that was distinct from their way. Something about the acknowledgement, something about the thanksgiving had brought about an extra measure of healing. Now, in our day, we know from people like Brene Brown that there is something powerful about the practice of gratitude. That when we count our blessings and name them one by one, there is something that is unlocked in us that brings about more joy and more satisfaction and more wholeness in life. And maybe that's what this leper was tapping into here. But what we also see here is that beyond the mental and emotional and physical benefits, there's something sacred as well. Something spiritual, something holy that happens when we respond in thanksgiving to the border crossing and boundary breaking love of Christ. This is a week of thanksgiving, and this is a story of thanksgiving. And as I was reading it this week, I couldn't help but think about another story of Thanksgiving. I read it not long ago in Reader's Digest, though it no doubt came from a time pre-COVID-19. It was about a classroom where there was no social distancing, but the teacher, in preparation for Thanksgiving, invited her first grade students to draw pictures. And these pictures were supposed to be of things that they were thankful for. And she was really eager to see what they would draw, not just because she loved them and they were her students, but also because she knew, living in the inner city where they were, that most of these students didn't come from much. That most of these students didn't have much materially, and many of these students were a part of home lives that were also pretty desperate as well. And so she wondered, as they drew out their works of thanksgiving, what they might bring forth from them. So she gave them time and they began to draw what they were thankful for. And most of it was pretty obvious, except she was a little struck by what she saw from little Douglas. Now, Douglas was someone that she knew lived in an especially desperate situation for a lot of reasons. And she'd wondered what he might draw. Douglas was someone who often stayed close to her, who stayed in her shadow, who didn't talk very much, who didn't express himself very much. But here she looked down at this picture he'd drawn of a hand. And she wondered what the hand was meant to represent. And so she actually asked the class, she held up Douglas's picture because it was pretty obvious what the other ones had drawn. She held up Douglas's picture and she said, "What do you think Douglas meant when he drew this hand?" And one of the students raised her hand and she said, "Well, maybe Douglas was drawing the hand of God. Because God provides all things for us and food and drink and shelter. And maybe Douglas was acknowledging his thanksgiving by drawing the hand of God." And another student said, well, I think maybe Douglas was drawing the hand of a farmer. Because the farmers work in the field and they provide food. Maybe Douglas is saying in anticipation for his Thanksgiving meal that he's thankful for farmers. And another young person raised his hand and he said, well, I think maybe Douglas was drawing the hand of a police officer. Because police officers protect us and they watch over us and they take care of us. And I think Douglas was drawing the hand of a police officer. And then finally, one other student who was often very serious, she said, well, I think that maybe the hand is a symbol and it's representative of all the other hands that Douglas is thankful for in his life. The teacher thought this turned out better than I could have imagined. What a great conversation to have on the week of Thanksgiving with these children, and you can all go back to your desk and continue with your work. And she almost forgot to ask little Douglas what he'd meant when he drew that hand. She looked down at him and his painting, his picture, and she said, so Douglas, whose hand was it? He said, teacher, it's yours. She remembered in that moment how sometimes she would, as she did with all the children, put her hand gently on his back to shepherd him along, to provide a moment of comfort when he was anxious, to help him get to where he needed to go. She hadn't thought much of it, but he did. She'd seen him, and he saw her. And because they'd seen each other, the teacher had this overwhelming feeling that maybe this was her Thanksgiving. I wonder who's seen you? Who's seen you the way she saw him? Who's seen you the way Jesus saw them? And I wonder who you've seen crossing boundaries, breaking barriers, bringing the love of God in some special and unique way into your own life. I wonder who you are thankful for. I wonder what you're thankful for this week. Thanksgiving can erupt in praise to God, the Scripture tells us. And so as we prepare to approach the table of Thanksgiving, where we celebrate the border crossing and boundary breaking love of God, I'd like for all of us to spend some time thinking about who and what we are thankful for, knowing that all the who's and all of the what's rise out of the boundary breaking and border crossing love of God. Something special happens when we give praise to God in thanksgiving. And so I want you to spend a few minutes thinking about what you're thankful for, and as you do, as a prompt, we're going to share what many of you have already shared with us. this gratitude video, which captures so much of what we're thankful for, and hopefully will stir us in these moments toward holy gratitude for our great and glorious God.